The first question comes from Tyler. Here's what Tyler asks. Hi, Zach. I hope you're doing well during these times. Thanks again for all the content. I have a dumb but hopefully easy to answer question. I was on Bill Hartman's site and he gave a really general recommendation of starting wides, wide infrasternal angles in supine, and narrows in prone for exercises, so like quadruped, things like that, due to the gravitational effect. Let's say I wanted to improve shoulder external rotation for a wide infrasternal angle. Would low reaching for posterior to inferior expansion in supine block expansion due to the table? If the answer is yes, then my question becomes, why would wide start in supine if generally you're trying to achieve inhalation or posterior expansion? Thanks in advance. This is quite a good question. I'm excited you asked this. So let's talk about positions first in terms of who to start what where. If we compare wide to narrow infrasternal angles, and let's just say this is a classic wide ISA or a narrow ISA, they have baseline levels of compensations. What I mean by that is you have someone who has just like the first layer of compensation. So if it's a wide infrasternal angle, they're going to have more concentric bias on the back side of their body. If it's a narrow infrasternal angle, they're going to have more concentric bias towards the front side of their body. And the reason why this has to do with the pelvis. My grandson coming in for the win. So with the pelvis, with a narrow infrasternal angle, they're going to be more counternutated, falling backwards, meaning front side's going to concentrically bias to upright, and vice versa for a wide. A wide is going to be more nutated, spine falling forwards. They're going to be more concentrically biased on the back side of the body. And that's the first layer of compensation. If you want to learn more, I will link a debrief in the show notes where I really deep dive into the layers of compensation. The show notes will be found on zachcouples.com/ISA. So let's talk about what Bill is discussing here, because he mentioned wides, supine position, narrows, prone position. What's the deal with that? Well, I'm glad you asked. If I put a wide in the supine position, gravity is going to be acting downward, and it's going to push the viscera and air downward. So you'll get more posterior expansion of the spine, which, if I'm concentrically biased on the backside of the body, you would want. So it's not a bad thing. For a narrow, and this is why like quadruped's useful for a narrow, scratch that. If I'm in prone or quadruped, now I have gravity still acting downward, but the guts and air is going to be more easily pushed forward, which is going to allow for better eccentric orientation of the front side of the body. And that's why those positions for those people who have primary compensations are quite useful. Now, one question that my homeboy Tyler asked was, well, Zach, doesn't lying on your back block airfill? No, I don't think it does, because you got to think about it this way, right? If I do some type of reach where my thorax is going backwards, I'm creating a relationship where the thorax is posterior relative to the scaps, and that can allow for some posterior expansion. If I'm on my back and I'm reaching, I still create that relationship. And really, in my opinion, because Tyler mentioned low reach, I haven't been using low reaches as much for wides for a couple reasons. One, a lot of times, especially if there's a secondary compensation, when a wide performs a low reach, they have a really hard time not engaging the pecs. If you are unable to reach without tensing your pecs, that's going to limit your ability to create posterior expansion. So that's one piece. The other piece, think about why the wide infrasternal angle is limited with posterior expansion. If they have a posterior expansion restriction, that is secondary to their structural bias. So if based on their ribcage structure, they have a nutated sacrum and they concentrically bias the back side, I find it actually more effective to get posterior expansion by manipulating the dynamics of the structure. So for a wide, if their ventral cavity is larger side to side and it's closed front to back, to me, it's much more effective to do things that compress the sides that would inherently give you some A to P expansion and oftentimes can improve the posterior restrictions you see with wides. That's why I start most wide infrasternal angles in the side-lying position. Because if you go to the great article by Takashima et al., 2017, I'll link it in the show notes, don't worry, you boys got you. If you go to that article, lying in the side-lying position will compress the lateral dimensions of the ribcage and increase anteriorly and posteriorly the anterior and posterior dimensions. That's why I like side-lying for a lot of my wides, because I can take advantage of that. That's especially true if they have secondary compensation. Stay tuned because I'm going to talk a little bit about that. For the narrow, you kind of have similar issues, or why a lot of times I will start narrows in supine is because, same article, Takashima, if you lie them in the supine position, that's going to increase the lateral dimensions of the rib cage, which is really useful. So I think supine or prone can be useful, assuming that they can keep a good stacked position for a narrow infrasternal angle. And I'll talk a little bit more about the stack later. Stay tuned. Let me just recap that real quick. Wides, supine can be useful if there's a primary compensation, namely they're concentric only on the back. I gravitate more towards side-lying because that takes advantage of compressing the thorax A and P. Narrows, prone, or quadruped can be really useful because of the gravitational effects. That will allow expansion more readily anteriorly, especially if that's the only compensation. But I think, in my opinion, supine is also useful because the supine position can increase the A to P dimensions, as long as you're being mindful of how they're stacking. Now, here's the issue. The issue is very rarely, and maybe this is just the population that I work with, but very rarely do you see a narrow or a wide infrasternal angle with only primary compensations. Usually they've thrown some other things in the mix, and that's leading to them having some more restrictions present, which we don't necessarily want. Now, let's take into consideration if they have a secondary restriction. Let's start with the wide. Why might supine not be useful for a wide ISA? If I have a situation where I have a secondary compensation for a wide, and what that would mean is they would have concentric bias on the front side of their body. So you're no doubt going to have the guts pushed more posteriorly as well as air, but also too, I'm going to have more concentric bias of stuff on the front because now gravity is pushing me further into that compensation. Think of it this way, right? So if I have a situation where my pump handle's down and I'm lying supine, the gravity is going to push me more down. So in that case, the supine position could be more challenging actually for a wide ISA. I've noticed this quite a bit with certain strategies if I've tried it in supine, because a lot of times you'll see someone try to tuck or they'll get an exhale, and these people, they'll really crunch down, and you'll see with a wide, you'll either see the belly start to flare out or you'll see a diastasis recti form, which what that is it's just a bowing out of the rectus abdominis. Kind of looks like they have an alien growing out of their stomach, which is undesirable because when I exhale, I want the abdominal wall to compress or get smaller. If that doesn't happen, then you're not going to get good movement options, which again is another reason why oftentimes I prefer side-lying for those people. Or what I've also found useful is if I do mess with supine and it's a wide who has a secondary compensation, I actually like the Lewitt position where the hips are at 90 degrees at the hips and knees. That seems to work pretty well also. Other positions that I like for wide starting them, if I have someone who's got secondary compensations, would be standing supported. That's also another great position to start a wide in. For the narrow, we actually have similar issues in quadruped if they have secondary compensations. A narrow secondary compensation is to go concentric on the back. If they're concentric on the back and I put them in prone or quadruped, you run into the same issue. If I'm concentrically biased backwards, that means I tense everything up in the back, the thorax migrates more anteriorly. Now I got gravity pushing me down. Oh crap, now I'm going to get pushed more and more into that position. You got problems. So for those folks, you might actually use supine, and supine is a lot of times much more effective because you can take advantage of gravity to push the air and viscera posteriorly to deal with that secondary compensation. That's why I think supine is useful for a narrow. In fact, I had a guy this week. He was a narrow infrasternal angle, and your boy was secondary compressed or compensated AF. He had limitations in all directions, shoulder mobility wise. Had I started him in quadruped, I mean, his back would have just stayed flat. We would have increased the posterior compressive strategy going on there. So I elected to start him in hook line, and we did a low reach. With the low reach, he was able to get a good reach. He wasn't over kicking in rectus abdominis, and he was able to feel posterior expansion in that region because we created that scapula forward, thorax back relationship. And after he did a few rounds of a hook line single arm reach, which I'll link in the show notes because I like you folks, after he did that, we had almost full ER, and I think he started at like 40-ish both sides, and we got him to about 80 with just that move, less pain too, which was really cool. So the point being with this is the rules aren't necessarily cut and dry in terms of where you should start someone. It all depends on what restrictions they have present. For me, if you have only primary compensations, a wide with a loss of flexion abduction ER, a narrow with a loss of extension adduction IR, you can start them in the case of a wide supine, the case of a narrow prone. But if that's not the case, you got other restrictions at play, which is most people. It's much more useful for wides to either start in side lying or standing. I don't use quadruped necessarily because that will still increase the concentric bias posteriorly. For narrows, I like supine, and I also like standing for them as well. Anything also for a narrow that's more inverted, like the drunken turtle, those are great moves as well for those who have secondary compensations. And those are generally the positions that I like to start my clients in. Great question, Tyler.